The handcuffs were already on him by the time the first patrol car's spotlight found his face, and the officer standing over him was still shouting the same 4 words he'd been shouting for the last 90 seconds. Get on the ground. Marcus Bell was already on the ground. His cheek was pressed into wet gravel outside a house worth $2.1 million. A house he had legal business standing in front of, and the man with his knee against Marcus's spine had a badge number stitched into his vest that read 4417. By the end of that night, Officer Cole Hastings would swear under oath that Marcus Bell had reached for something. What no one in Bellhaven Estates knew that evening, not the neighbors filming from behind curtains, not the responding backup unit, not even Hastings himself, was that the man face down in his own client's driveway carried federal credentials in his jacket pocket that could end careers with a single phone call. Marcus never reached for them. He simply lay there, counting his own heartbeat, the way he'd trained himself to do for the last 22 years. By the time this story ends, the officer so certain of his own authority that night would lose his badge, his pension, and very nearly his freedom. What took him down wasn't Marcus Bell's federal title. It was a 15-year-old promise, kept by a girl who once refused a stranger's money under a different bridge in a different city, and grew up to walk into a courtroom and refuse to let a verdict stand that was built on a lie. The road to that driveway had actually begun 48 hours earlier, but if you want the real beginning, you have to go back 15 years. To a January so cold it felt less like weather and more like an interrogation. Savannah doesn't often get nights like that. Nights where the air finds every gap in a coat and asks what exactly you're doing outside. Marcus Bell was 34 years old that winter, 3 years into a career with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and he was not where he was supposed to be. He was crouched behind a delivery truck 2 blocks from the 4th District Station House, watching a back door that opened and closed at irregular hours, building a case file that 13 different supervisors had told him to drop. He heard the sound before he saw anything. A child trying very hard not to cry and failing with dignity. Under the overpass on Yamacraw Street, wedged into a gap where the concrete blocked most of the wind, a girl no older than 9 sat with both arms locked around a smaller boy. She looked up at him with an expression that had no business existing on a face that young. Not fear exactly, calculation. She was doing math, weighing whether the stranger in front of her was a threat, and her body had already angled itself between Marcus and the boy in her arms, which told him everything about what her answer would be if the math came out wrong. "I'm not going to hurt you," Marcus said, which is precisely the sentence every dangerous man in recorded history has used to open a conversation, and he knew it the moment it left his mouth. "We don't need anything," she said. He crouched anyway, close enough now to see the boy's lips had gone the pale gray of the sidewalk beneath them. He pulled a folded 20 from his coat and held it toward her. She looked at it like he'd offered her a live wire instead of cash. "We don't need money," she said. "We need food, real food, not something you hand somebody so you can feel better about yourself and go home." Marcus Bell, a man who had once talked down an armed suspect for 11 minutes without raising his voice, found himself for maybe the first time in his adult life without a single scripted response ready. 2 men rounded the corner of the underpass before he could think of one, the kind of men who look for exactly this scene from a distance because it reads as an easy target. One reached for the girl's arm. Marcus moved before conscious thought caught up to his hands, and within 8 seconds both men were on the concrete, disoriented, reconsidering several recent life choices. It wasn't heroism. It was a federal agent's training wearing a stranger's coat. The girl watched the whole thing without flinching, filing it away as one more data point about the man in front of her. "You're not a good person," she said afterward. And it wasn't an accusation, just an observation, delivered the way you'd note the temperature. No, Marcus agreed. I'm not. Her brother's breathing had gone shallow and wet by then, and Marcus, against every protocol that had kept his cover intact for 3 years, picked the boy up himself and carried him to his car, the girl following 3 steps behind, refusing to let the gap between them close to 2. The hospital did everything it could. It wasn't enough. 3 days later, in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and bad news, a doctor delivered pneumonia too advanced and too long untreated. The kind of sentence that arrives without warning and leaves without mercy. No one had known to look for a sick child under a bridge. That was rather the point of bridges. The girl didn't cry where anyone could see her. Marcus only found out she had because he found her afterward in a stairwell, dry-eyed and furious in the specific way of someone determined not to be caught grieving. He didn't offer comfort. He offered a decision instead. You're coming home with me, he said. I don't need charity, she said. It's not charity, he told her. Charity is what people do to feel better about themselves. This is a mistake I'm choosing to make on purpose. Something that wasn't quite a smile crossed her face for the first time. That's the most honest thing you've said all night, she told him. Her name, she said in the car, was Camille. His colleagues, when they found out, assumed a girlfriend's kid, a mistake, a temporary arrangement. None of them guessed the truth. That somewhere between building a federal case and arranging a man's disappearance from a homicide charge that same week, Marcus Bell had acquired something he had absolutely no training in surviving. A daughter who would spend the rest of her childhood informing him, in increasingly precise language, that the world he worked inside of was broken in ways he'd stopped noticing. Camille's first year in his 2-bedroom apartment near Forsyth Park was less an adoption and more a prolonged, mostly silent negotiation. Marcus kept his real job hidden from her the way he kept it hidden from everyone, out of habit and operational necessity, letting her assume he worked logistics for the county. She noticed everything anyway. She noticed the government sedan that picked him up some mornings. She noticed the men in dark suits who came to the apartment twice a year and spoke to him in a tone reserved for someone with real authority. She noticed the locked drawer in his desk that held a badge she wasn't supposed to know existed. She was 11 when she finally said something about it at dinner. "You're a cop," she announced, the way another kid might announce a fact about dinosaurs, or something like one. I looked up what federal plates mean. Marcus set down his fork with the particular care of a man buying himself time to think. That's a serious guess for someone who still needs a step stool to reach the top shelf, he said. I don't need the step stool anymore, she said. And it's not a guess. It's an observation. I'm not going to tell anyone. She went back to her rice. That single sentence did more to unsettle him than any suspect interview he'd ever run. He responded to the discomfort the only way he knew how, by throwing every resource he had at her education until the feeling passed. He found her tutors, then better tutors, then a retired constitutional law professor willing to spend Saturday mornings teaching a 12-year-old case law for a fee that made even Marcus wince. He told himself it was about opportunity. If he'd been honest with himself late at night, which he rarely allowed himself to be, it was closer to penance, though he couldn't have said for what exactly. By 14, Camille had read enough federal case law to make his own colleagues visibly nervous when she sat in on conversations she technically wasn't invited to. Your job's built on a system that fails people who look like us more than it protects them, she told him one evening, doing her homework at his desk instead of hers. You should read some history. I have read history, Marcus said. That's exactly why I do this job the way I do it. Then you're not reading it right, she said. He should have been irritated. Any of his fellow agents would have called that insolence. Instead, he found himself fighting something dangerously close to pride, which he buried immediately because pride was a liability in a career built on staying invisible. She started calling him Dad in her second year with him, though the word carried an edge for a long time, less warmth than a running argument neither of them had finished. By 17, she'd decided on law school before she'd decided on almost anything else in her life, civil rights law specifically, the exact area of federal work Marcus had spent 2 decades quietly inside of without ever telling her the details. She got into a program in Atlanta on a full scholarship. Marcus stood in the doorway of her dorm room, 12 years after a frozen night under an overpass, and told her the closest thing to the truth he'd ever told anyone outside his agency. "I investigate police departments," he said. "That's my actual job. Has been the whole time." Camille didn't look surprised. "I know," she said. "I've known since I was 15. I found the case files. I just needed you to tell me yourself." 9 years passed the way years do when you're building a career instead of watching a clock. Camille through law school, through a clerkship, into a small but sharp civil rights practice in Savannah that took cases most firms wouldn't touch. Marcus kept working, kept investigating, kept his badge in a drawer at home and his public identity as unremarkable as he could manage. Driving the same 11-year-old Ford truck he'd had since Camille was in middle school, wearing flannel to grocery stores and government issue only inside federal buildings. On the Tuesday in question, September the 17th, at 11:47 in the morning, Marcus had a meeting scheduled at a house in Belhaven Estates belonging to a confidential source, a patrol sergeant willing to testify about a pattern his own department had spent 4 years covering up. 23 prior misconduct complaints, all filed against the same officer, all resolved the same way, quietly, internally, with no discipline attached. Marcus's federal investigation into the 4th District had been open for 11 months by then. That evening's meeting was supposed to be routine, a handoff of documents in a driveway, nothing more. Officer Cole Hastings had been on patrol in Belhaven Estates for 6 years. Ever since his uncle, City Councilman Grady Hastings, had arranged a transfer out of a rougher district and into the kind of neighborhood where residents wrote thank you notes to the department instead of complaints. Cole believed, with the total conviction of a man who has never once been asked to prove it, that he could read a threat on sight. He believed a black man standing beside a parked, unfamiliar sedan in a gated community at 10:30 at night, dressed in a flannel jacket and jeans, was not there for a legitimate reason, badge or no badge. When Cole ran the plate and got a government registration back, he decided out loud to his partner that it was probably stolen or borrowed. When Marcus reached slowly into his jacket to produce the federal credentials he was required to carry, Cole read the motion as a threat and put him on the ground before the sentence "I'm a federal officer" had finished leaving Marcus's mouth. The knee stayed on his spine for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Marcus's left wrist would later require a titanium plate to set properly. The county medical examiner who reviewed the injury report would call the force used disproportionate to any resistance documented on the responding unit's own dash cameras, which had, by pure administrative luck, been recording the entire time. Cole's official report claimed Marcus had reached for a concealed weapon and resisted arrest for nearly 2 minutes before backup subdued him. The charges filed that night were resisting arrest, trespassing, and assault on a police officer. Marcus's federal credentials were logged into evidence and, through an oversight his own agency would spend months trying to explain, never cross-referenced against his employment file for 11 full days. In those 11 days, Marcus Bell, senior investigator for the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, sat in the Chatham County Jail as a John Doe assault suspect. His own investigation into the 4th District effectively frozen because the man running it had just become, on paper, one of its subjects. His supervisors in Washington, when they finally located him, were furious, embarrassed, and slow, the way large institutions often are when the mistake is theirs to fix. The 4th District, meanwhile, closed ranks with the practiced efficiency of a department that had done this before. Cole's union representative, Sergeant Roy Danvers, told reporters the officer had followed protocol to the letter given the totality of the circumstances. Captain Neil Ashcroft, who supervised Cole and who had personally signed off on closing all 23 prior complaints without discipline, told the local news that his department stood fully behind Officer Hastings' judgment in a tense and rapidly evolving situation. Camille Bell heard about her father's arrest from a colleague 40 minutes after it happened. On the same night, she'd planned to bring him dinner. She was in the county jail's visitation room within 2 hours, and when she saw her father's wrist in a temporary splint and the bruising along his jaw, something in her went very still, the particular stillness of someone who has decided, calmly and completely, exactly what she's about to do next. "I'm taking your case," she told him. "You're my daughter, not my lawyer," he said. "I'm both," she said, "and neither one of us gets to pick which today." Marcus should have argued. He'd spent 30 years training himself to argue for exactly this kind of caution. Instead, he found himself doing something he'd done maybe twice before in his life, letting someone he trusted more than his own judgment tell him what came next. The months that followed unfolded less like a single dramatic showdown and more like the slow accumulation of small, unglamorous decisions, which is generally how real accountability actually happens. Camille filed for the dash camera footage first, the recording from Cole's own patrol vehicle that the department had initially claimed was corrupted. It wasn't corrupted. It had simply never been reviewed by anyone above the rank of sergeant, because no one in the 4th District had expected the John Doe in custody to have a federal law degree's worth of legal representation showing up 8 days into the case. The footage showed exactly 4 minutes and 11 seconds of a man lying still on the ground, hands visible, saying, "I'm a federal officer. My credentials are in my left jacket pocket," 17 times before the knee finally lifted off his back. Camille found the 23 prior complaints next, buried in an internal affairs database that Captain Ashcroft's office had marked closed without ever notifying the county's Civilian Oversight Board, which by statute was supposed to review any file with more than 5 substantiated complaints against a single officer. She found 3 former Belhaven Estates residents willing to testify on the record. A retired schoolteacher who'd watched Cole detain her nephew for walking through the neighborhood at dusk. A contractor who'd been stopped twice in 1 month doing landscaping work he had a permit for, and a young man, now 26, who had been 12 years old the first time Cole Hastings had drawn a weapon on him for riding a bicycle past a house that wasn't his own. The trial itself, when it finally opened in the Chatham County Courthouse, ran 9 days. And it was on the 6th day that Camille Bell stood up in a courtroom built of marble and old cypress wood, and did something the local paper would later call the moment the case actually turned. She didn't raise her voice. She laid 3 things on the evidence table in careful sequence: the dash camera transcript, the 23 prior complaints Captain Ashcroft had personally signed off closing, and a sworn statement from the confidential patrol sergeant, the same man her father had been driving to meet the night of the arrest, who confirmed under oath that Ashcroft had instructed him in writing to keep every Hastings complaint out of the department's official misconduct database. This department didn't fail my father because one officer made a mistake in the dark, Camille told the jury. It failed him because a captain decided, 23 separate times. That protecting one officer's record mattered more than protecting the people that officer was supposed to serve. My father spent his entire career trying to fix departments exactly like this one. I'm not interested in letting this one walk away from what it actually did. Cole Hastings never admitted fault, not once, not during the internal affairs review that followed, not during his own testimony, not even after the jury returned its verdict. He told investigators he'd made the correct call, given what he knew in the moment. And he continued to say it, even as the evidence against him grew, doubling down each time instead of stepping back, which is exactly how a man like that loses everything, one refusal to reconsider at a time. The verdict came down on the 9th day. All charges against Marcus Bell were dismissed with prejudice. Officer Cole Hastings was indicted on charges of falsifying a police report and excessive use of force, and a separate federal civil rights investigation opened in the weeks following the trial, expanded to examine the entire 4th District's pattern of complaint suppression under Captain Ashcroft's command. Ashcroft resigned before the department's disciplinary hearing could conclude. Cole lost his badge, his pension, and eventually his freedom, sentenced to 18 months for the falsified report alone. The assault charge folded into a plea that spared the county a second trial. Sergeant Roy Danvers, the union representative who'd defended Hastings so loudly to reporters, quietly declined to comment when the same reporters called back 4 months later. The changes that followed didn't happen all at once, in one cinematic sweep, the way they might in a story built for applause rather than truth. They happened in pieces, smaller and more procedural than the courtroom drama that preceded them, which is usually how real reform actually works. The 4th District entered a consent decree with the Department of Justice within the year, mandating an independent oversight board with actual authority to review use of force complaints, something the county had voted down twice before Camille's case made it politically impossible to vote down a third time. Officers who'd spent years avoiding scrutiny under Ashcroft's command found themselves facing a different kind of test, whether they could function in a department that no longer let complaints simply vanish. Some couldn't and left. Others stayed, discovering, some with visible discomfort, that accountability required considerably more effort than the old system had, and produced, against every instinct several of them had trusted for years, considerably more trust from the neighborhoods they patrolled. Camille didn't take a role inside the department's new oversight structure. She was offered a seat twice and turned it down both times with the same stubbornness she'd once used to refuse a stranger's $20 bill under an overpass. "This isn't mine to sit inside of," she told her father. "It's yours to help fix from where you already stand. I'll build what stands outside it." What she built instead was a foundation, funded partly from the settlement Chatham County paid Marcus, and partly from donors who'd followed the trial, providing free legal representation to families facing exactly the kind of complaint her father's case had exposed. She named it after her brother, the boy who had died under a bridge before anyone came looking for him, calling it simply the Elijah Fund, deliberately keeping her own name and her father's off every building and every piece of paperwork it touched. People should trust the work, she told a reporter who asked why, not the name attached to it. Marcus, for his part, found the return to ordinary life harder than any undercover assignment he'd ever run. Being believed, it turned out, was a strange kind of adjustment after 11 days of being disbelieved by his own institutions. He went back to federal work eventually, transferred to a different division at his own request, one that trained new agents on exactly the failures that had nearly buried him. "I used to think doing this job meant staying invisible enough that nothing ever touched you," he told Camille one evening. Years later, the two of them reviewing a grant application for the fund at his kitchen table. You taught me it means being seen clearly, even when it's inconvenient, and choosing to stay anyway. I didn't teach you that, she said. You taught yourself. I just kept showing up until you ran out of excuses not to notice. Winter returned to Savannah the way it always does, without apology, cracking the pavement and testing coats exactly as it had 15 years earlier. The overpass on Yamacraw Street looked the same as it always had, unremarkable, gray, the kind of place people walked past without a second glance. Which was, of course, exactly why it had once hidden a girl and her brother so completely from a city that should have found them sooner. Marcus stood beneath it now, older, his wrist aching faintly the way old injuries do in the cold, a habit rather than a warning anymore. Beside him, Camille set down a box of food, the way they'd done every winter since the trial, a small ritual that had started as her insistence and become, over the years, something he genuinely looked forward to instead of merely tolerating. You didn't have to keep doing this, she said, watching him arrange the box with more care than the task strictly required. Neither did you, he said. And yet, she smiled, the rare, unguarded kind that still caught him off guard after all these years. A reminder of exactly how much had changed since a 9-year-old girl had looked at him under this same overpass and calmly informed him he wasn't a good person. I was wrong that night, she said. You weren't a bad person. You just hadn't finished the math yet, and neither had I. The fund she'd built now supported 6 legal aid clinics across 3 counties and a scholarship program that had, so far, put more kids through college than any local news segment had ever bothered reporting. Mostly because a story about accountability without a villain left to sneer at didn't make for particularly dramatic headlines. Somewhere beneath another overpass in another part of the city, another child might be cold tonight, might be hungry, might be doing the same silent calculations Camille once had, deciding whether the stranger in front of them was a threat or, against every reasonable expectation, an unlikely second chance. Justice, it turned out, wasn't the single dramatic gesture the courtroom dramas liked to sell. It was patient, unglamorous, and compounding, built one honest decision at a time, until a girl who once refused a stranger's money and a man who once nearly lost everything to a lie had built together something considerably stronger than either fear or forgiveness alone. It was simply the only kind of justice built to actually last. A federal civil rights investigator is thrown to the ground and arrested in a gated Savannah neighborhood by an officer who decides, in under a minute, that he doesn't belong there. 15 years earlier, that same man pulled a homeless girl and her dying brother out from under a bridge in the dead of winter. Now she's the attorney standing between him and a system built to protect its own. A story about power, profiling, and the kind of justice that takes 15 years and one refusal to look away. If a story like this held your attention, subscribe for more. New episodes drop every week. This story is a work of fiction. All names, departments, and events are invented, and any resemblance to real people or real cases is coincidental. It was written to explore something true, even inside a story that isn't. That dignity doesn't announce itself, and that the people we underestimate are often the ones quietly holding everything together. What stayed with me writing this wasn't the arrest or the trial. It was the idea that real change rarely looks like a single dramatic win. It looks like someone showing up year after year until the people around them run out of excuses not to notice. That's worth remembering long after the credits roll.